there's a revived bill in the House of Representatives to ban all Chinese students from getting student visas to study here. That's assuming that all students are the same, that they're cut from the same cloth, that they should be treated as a category, and that's just factually wrong.
My name is Margot Landman, and I am Deputy Vice President for Programs at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today's interview. Emily Feng is an international correspondent for NPR. Her wonderful new book, Let Only Red Flowers Bloom: Identity and Belonging in Xi Jinping's China, has recently been published by Penguin Random House. Welcome, Emily.
Thanks so much for having me, Margot.
It's a pleasure. As a correspondent based in Beijing and then Taipei, thinking about writing a book, you could have explored many different topics. What made you go in the direction of Chinese identity and what it means to be Chinese, both inside China and beyond?
So when I was thinking about writing the book, I realized all the topics I was most interested in, the stories that really stuck with me, the characters that spoke to me years after I'd met them, all somehow tied back to facets of identity. When I thought, is there a common theme between all these people and what draws me to them? It was that they represented different facets of identity, whether political or economic, so more conceptual, or something more concrete, gender, ethnicity, language. And what attracted me to China and what made it such a fascinating story to report was that there was such diversity of identity and diversity of thought in this country. And I got to cover all of that in one beat, which is amazing. But I also felt like a lot of the policies that changed in my time in China, which was 2015 to 2022, had to do with this preoccupation with shrinking that space for expression of identity and different political views. So I wanted to write a book that captured that tension, the natural diversity that you find in China, how the state conceptualizes that, how it's changed over time. You know, it's kind of an accordion. Sometimes there's more space, sometimes there's less. And unfortunately, the stories that I was writing often take place in a shrinking space for identity and diversity.
It's interesting thinking about China as so diverse, because I think the tendency here is to see it as a very homogeneous place or homogeneous place. You profile in the book about 12 people. Out of these 1.4 billion Chinese, how did you choose who to focus on?
It was about finding people who I felt represented, who distilled down different facets of Chinese society and identity that I'd encountered. So I wanted to focus on someone who I thought opened up a broader discussion about gender, or about online discourse, or about language politics, or about China's relationship between the mainland and Hong Kong. And then organically also, when I reported these stories, some people started to move. So some people who I met in Taiwan then moved to the US, and I end the book in the US about the Chinese diaspora. Or people who I'd met in Hong Kong ended up in Taiwan. So you had characters interacting and their stories layering upon each other in interesting ways. But part of it was kind of just who I naturally met and felt myself attracted to on an intellectual, on a literary level. And also some of it was thinking about what kind of diversity do I want to showcase to people who might otherwise never pick up a book about China. This is not meant to be a textbook or to be academic or policy driven. It's really, I hope, entertaining and give people a snapshot of like the actual feel and texture of being in China and encountering that wonderful diversity themselves.
Can you tell us about a couple of the characters?
Sure. So one of my favorite characters is this scooter thief named Zhou Liqi, and this was just a complete accidental story. I was trying to write about online censorship a few years ago during the COVID pandemic, and I ended up focusing on this man who goes viral on the Chinese internet for stealing scooters quite unsuccessfully. He goes to prison multiple times because he's caught. And He is a super unlikely online star. He's known for being a thief. That's why he's famous. At the same time, Chinese censors want to promote what they call positive energy online. So feel-good stories that that propagate like good social virtue, not necessarily theft. And so he finds himself caught in between wanting to be famous, but also having to leave behind the reputation that made him so famous to begin with. And it gets into this broader discussion about slacker culture and about lying flat in China, and of course how the state wants its citizens to be productive, but also this unique online environment where there's so much content being produced in Mandarin in mainland China these days. Some of it's controlled, some of it's not. There's incredible diversity of content out there, but of course there are sometimes invisible controls as well. And I thought the story of this one man illustrated that so colorfully. And then there are stories that I followed as they traversed boundaries. So one story that I reported from Beijing at the time was about a young Chinese college student who had been studying abroad in Taiwan and decides to make this video in Taiwan denouncing Xi Jinping. And he doesn't know what he's getting himself into, but he thinks that Taiwanese society will welcome him with open arms, and it doesn't. And so through him, I get into this broader discussion of how does Taiwan see itself in the greater Chinese-speaking population in the world? Where does it see itself in relation to the political tensions that China has with the rest of the world? And how does it see people from China, even if they're speaking the same language and trying to espouse what they think are the same political values as people in Taiwan?
I found that particularly shocking because he seemed so naive. Yes, he was outside of the mainland, but he should have known, might have known, that the things he was saying were incendiary.
And not many people were watching. But I think also, as I profiled him and got to know him over the years, I realized he had come to Taiwan thinking that it was his gateway to a bigger world. He grew up in a very, very parochial, small town in northern China, and he thought he'd be able to see more of the world if he lived in Taiwan. So yes, it was impulsive. Yes, it was naive. And the adventure is still ongoing. I mean, he's still in Taiwan. He finally has residence now, but it's been a multi-year process.
Did you use real names?
It depended on the character. Mm-hmm. So a number of people are now outside of China, and a number of people, about half, are in NPR stories and have been named. And for them, if they were comfortable, I used their real name. One of the titular characters is a man named Yusuf. He has a Chinese name. He also has a pen name. I used neither because he feels sensitive about his status and he still has family members in China. And so for that, I used his Arabic name, which he very much identifies with, but it doesn't make him identifiable. So it depended on the person and their circumstances.
Uh-huh. You frame your book against the backdrop of Xi Jinping's conception of Chineseness. How does he describe or explain the idea? And how do the people you write about define themselves in accordance with or in opposition to President Xi's definition of 中国人, Chinese person?
It sounds weird to say out loud because I think that Chinese politics is not often distilled down in terms of identity politics, but I think that in a weird way, identity politics is so central to domestic policies and even foreign policy, national security policy that China is concerned with over the last few years. So I think that Xi Jinping, or at least the Communist Party under Xi Jinping, has been much more preoccupied with trying to make its citizens more Han-centric, more party loyal. I mean, one thing that I really felt living in China from 2015 to 2022 was the party suddenly was so much, not suddenly, but very quickly was so much more visible in all the levels of daily life, and the minutiae of ordinary citizens' lives and education, visually in cities. And that was a change that happened in just the first 3 years or so that I was living in China.
So before COVID.
Before COVID. And it accelerated, of course, with COVID. I think that the party is much more concerned with gender these days and more pro-natalist policies. And that's become sometimes painfully obvious over the post-COVID, over the last 2 or 3 years. I think that the party has become much more concerned, and it always has been, about propagating Mandarin language education. And I mentioned being Han-centric, the majority ethnic group in China. But that's bled through more, of course, with things like the Uyghur crisis in Xinjiang, and then that's created templates for policies that have been propagated, spread outside of the Xinjiang region to other regions and provinces. And all of it comes down to, I think, a preoccupation that Xi Jinping personally has with the stability and political cohesion of the People's Republic of China. And that's understandable. When you look at history, and he looks at Soviet history, he sees the dissolution of the Soviet Union as the culmination of many, many sectarian splits along ethnic, linguistic, and political lines. And so it's been his duty in his mind to make sure that doesn't happen in China. And every country is concerned with trying to foster unity and cohesion. The United States is no exception. I think that in China, what stuck out to me was that it was happening on such a minute detail in sometimes people's personal lives, and it was starting to disseminate into language policy, education, migration, and then eventually national security. And I wanted to write stories that got into it from a human perspective, to give readers a sense of what that felt like on the ground if you were someone directly affected by that.
So how do your characters either accept or challenge Xi's definition of what it is to be Chinese?
I wanted to highlight people who are challenging these definitions. I think that's always more interesting. And I want to say these people who I chose to profile are not dissidents. For the most part, they're not famous activists in any way. Many of them begin their journeys in this book as quite patriotic and identify very strongly with Chinese identity, whatever that means to them, or at least the Chinese project of contributing to developing the country. So they find themselves caught up in political events or by policies they didn't see coming, and decide to try to make space for themselves, whether that's because they are looking for alternative family structures, or they're trying to fight back against curricular changes and textbook reform, or whether they're a Uyghur family who've suddenly been separated because of security policies in Xinjiang. And I wanted to show that diversity exists in China. Yes, there are measures to control it, but also people find ways to live despite those structures. They still find ways to live semi-normal lives.
With the man in Inner Mongolia, it almost seemed as though he was drawn inadvertently into a different understanding of what his identity was.
Right. So this is a man who grows up speaking Mongolian as a mother tongue, but very, very early on, as Han migration, it's cheaper to live in Inner Mongolia. There's a lot of land. There were beneficial business policies to get people to set up small enterprises in Inner Mongolia, which is actually great. It developed the economy. Unfortunately, it was happening alongside pretty large-scale state-driven extractive industries. But he starts learning Mandarin Chinese and becomes fluent in Mandarin. It's his best language. He basically forgets his own Mongolian, and it's only until he's an adult that he begins to think more critically about how important language is to his worldview. And it's the protests in Hong Kong in 2019 that give him a visual and political vocabulary to describe these things he's been feeling. That was interesting to me, that there was this cross-pollination in issues.
Well, how did he even know about the protests in Hong Kong?
He was an IT professional, and so he'd set up his own VPN, his own software to bypass censorship controls online. So he was on Twitter, he was on Instagram, he was on Telegram, and he was just saving all of these videos that he was seeing happen in Hong Kong.
And then it came back to bite him.
Police end up finding this hard drive where he'd saved all these videos, and that's what gets him into serious trouble.
Yeah. The first chapters of the book discuss people within mainland China, and then you expand the focus outward to Hong Kong, Taiwan, and eventually the United States. How do you think about these widening circles of people, some of whom consider themselves Chinese while others do not?
I wanted to expand the scope of the book because I, in part, think that Chinese identity is not confined within borders. And that's a story of globalization, of migration, of the fact that the PRC is a relatively new political entity as well. And this idea of being Chinese has existed in various forms and been contested and artificially constructed. But it's been around for thousands of years. And that history is fascinating as well. It's one of empire, it's one of assimilation, it's one of cultural production. And I think all the tensions and discussion about US-China relations comes back to, well, I didn't want that to be a focus of the book, but I wanted to get into it on a human level of showing the fact that the two countries sometimes are very similar, that people are inextricably tied on a personal, economic, or political level between the US and China, sometimes in very, very weird ways, and sometimes fun ways. And I wanted to highlight that in the last chapter of the book. And throw it forward a little bit, because I think that's where the more interesting discussions are to be had going forward about Chineseness. So many Chinese people now live outside of the PRC, outside of Mandarin language dominant societies, but they're still writing in Chinese and they're still speaking in Mandarin. And part of that discourse, whether they're in Europe or South America or North America, and I think that's where a lot of the tensions might come from. Countries are thinking about how they're going to relate to those communities. But I think it's where a lot of the interesting work is being done in journalism and in media.
Mm-hmm. So to follow up on that a bit, what do you think, even though it's not a focus of the book, we are the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, what are some of the implications of the differing views of what it means to be Chinese for the United States and for U.S.-China relations?
You see something like this even with the debate. There's a revived bill in the House of Representatives to ban all Chinese students from getting student visas to study here. That's assuming that all students are the same, that they're cut from the same cloth, that they should be treated as a category. And that's just factually wrong. I think that the book is trying to show that when you think of China, it's a big country. The country itself, who it represents, its identity, the people who live there, are incredibly diverse. They believe many, many different things. They've walked many different paths. They speak even different languages. To call them all Chinese might even be misleading, even though their citizenship might be to the one country. And I think to design policy that treats them as a homogeneous group of people is not accurate, and it's not productive.
Do you think the book will be translated into Chinese?
It will.
Yeah.
In Taiwan.
Uh-huh. How do you think it might be received by Chinese people reading it, either in English or in Chinese?
One of the reasons why it was so important to me to translate the book into Mandarin is because I'm hoping to have the discussion with people once they read the book. And I am curious. I think that the most critical might say that I'm being splittist, that I'm intentionally trying to promote sectarianism in China, and I'm not. I think that diversity is something to be celebrated, and it doesn't take away from the whole that is the PRC. I am also curious about what people in Taiwan might think of the book, whether they might even care. When I was just living there for the last 2 years and I just moved away last December, I think there is less and less interest in what's happening in China as the two places disentangle politically, certainly economically. Post-COVID, there's been no revival of mainstream tourism or of economic exchanges even across the strait. And so I'm hoping that this provokes more interest in China as a country of people who are interesting, not necessarily as a political subject.
This is beyond the confines of the book, but when you moved from Beijing to Taipei, what were some of the differences and or similarities that struck you?
Mandarin is spoken in both places. Taiwan is so different from China. And I had realized, I had done reporting trips in Taiwan, but I realized I was missing so much each time I went to Taiwan when I was there just traveling on 2-week assignments than when I lived there. Taiwan is incredibly diverse in its own right. It has a very, very varied history and layers of various colonial empires basically layered on top of one another. the Chinese language one being maybe the most recent iteration of political influence in Taiwan. And Taiwan really gave me the space actually to think about this book. And I wrote most of my book in Taiwan, and it shaped the last third where the book ended up. When I got to Taiwan, I think for the first time, I really felt like I was in a place where people understood the full spectrum and the different gradients of Chinese identity. And that's in part because Taiwanese identity is influenced by various forms of Chinese identity. And then they've taken it one step further. They've made it uniquely Taiwanese. They've imbibed Southeast Asian influences, Japanese influences, obviously. And I think people immediately understood where I came from when I explained my life story. Whereas in China, I think people often got confused. You look Chinese, you sound Chinese, you speak Chinese, so you are Chinese, right? Whereas in Taiwan, people would say, you sound like you're from Beijing, but you live here and you say you're American. It makes complete sense to us because they have all combination of Chinese, Taiwanese, American, Southeast Asia, whatever, in one place, which I found really wonderful and freeing.
Huh, that's really interesting. Unfortunately, we're coming close to the end of our time. Is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to add?
I hope that people who are non-China specialists and not China watchers read this, because it's not supposed to be wonky or even educational, but I hope it just makes people feel like people in China are also people, and they have full stories and personal histories that are interesting on their own merits, outside of US-China relations, outside of geopolitics.
Well, I'm not your target audience, but I think it's a very accessible book.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and insights with us. I'd also like to thank the National Committee staff members behind the scenes who've made today's interview possible. We hope that you found the interview interesting and informative, and that you will join us again for future National Committee programming. Thanks again, Emily, and
Thank you,
goodbye.
Margot.